great to have everybody here. We're happy you're here. We're going to talk about how you can leverage the Microsoft Government Cloud in relation to building and understanding what your compliance boundary is. So a little bit of what I do on the kind of the front end for Summit 7 is I help consult companies in relation to where that CUI boundary might be, right? Whether it's a 1, 2, 3 person manufacturing company, all the way up to 50,000+ users that are doing a portion of their work directly with the DoD. And so as you can imagine, it's a pretty wide spectrum, but everyone has the same problem. So we need to help find solutions to that, which is why we're here today. All right, so the agenda is really 2 main components. And I have a lot of pictures, don't worry, I'm not a big text guy, but identification of CUI and system scope. So the very first step is we need to understand contractually where some of those CUI requirements might be coming from. At this point, you probably have a very strong understanding of what that is. But then also a system scope, right? What systems are part of that boundary? And then we're going to end up kind of leveraging at the tail end, talking about the technical solutions that Microsoft can provide that we can help offer you. So.
And before we jump into the system scope piece, I'd like to just mention that we are still waiting on actual scoping guidance from the government, okay? The government, DoD, has not provided us official scoping guidance yet. So everything that you see here is based on, our interpretation of what scoping needs to look like. And that may change once the government actually releases official guidance. So, stay tuned and we'll see what happens. But that scoping guidance, I think we're going to see. I know it has been finished. I know it has been reviewed, and we're waiting on final release. I'm hoping in the next 2-ish, 3-ish weeks, maybe, something like that. There should be a lot of information coming out in the next month and a half, I would expect, about all the things that we're all waiting on. Hopefully we start to see some of that information start trickling out. So still waiting on official guidance from the government on scope.
One thing we do want to talk about is contract clauses. I'm not going to berate this too much, but the 2 main ones as it relates to technical implementations that you guys are well aware of is the DFARS 7012 as well as the DFARS 7021. So 7012 been around for quite a while now. Everyone's very well versed in that at this point. In talking to organizations, what amazes me is when I talk to technical individuals versus executives or contract managers. Contract managers will say, hey, go implement NIST 800-171. Wonderful, that's great. You should go do that, right? But also they leave out some core things. I think somebody brought it up earlier, things like cyber incident reporting, what the requirements are for that. FedRAMP moderate equivalent, like was spoken about earlier. So just know that when you're going through these clauses, just saying the words NIST 800-171 to an IT person is not going to be enough. And if you're in IT and you're in the DoD space, raise your hand and say, hey guys, I think there's a little bit more to this than just NIST 800-171, as we are very well versed over the past 2 sessions.
Yeah, so absolutely. So if you're in IT, do not let an executive point to you and say, this is your baby. Because it's not your baby. This is an organizational-wide challenge. This is not an IT problem.
Right.
IT is a portion of the solution, but it is not an IT problem. It is an organizational problem.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about system scope. There's obviously some additional guidance in relation to this. But covered contractor information system, we're talking about an information system that is owned or operated by a contractor that processes, stores, or transmit covered defense information. It was interesting. I was talking to a guy over here named Ryan, and he went as far as trying to understand what a shredder does, right? Does it store for like half a second? Does it process CUI when it shreds it? But just knowing that this is a very kind of open question, but a good blueprint to lay against the systems that are going to store or process CUI as part of that boundary. Anything to say?
No.
So CUI classifications, again, this is a little bit high level. This is straight from Jacob. I stole this from one of his slide decks previously. But there's 2 main categories that we like to talk about in relation to CUI. There's CUI basic, which requires NIST 800-171 controls as in part by DFARS 7012. And then there's also CUI specified. So CUI specified is going to be things above and beyond just the NIST 800-171 baseline to configure those systems, right? Now, there's a little bit of kind of unique talk in the industry, and I'm going to let Scott kind of comment on this. There's a new FAR CUI ruling coming out, I think here shortly, that could impact even more than just traditional DoD systems, right? So Scott, I'll let
Yeah,
you kind of
absolutely.
address that.
So when you get to CUI specified, we're talking about, as you can see on the screen, things like ITAR data, things like UNNPI, so naval nuclear propulsion information. That's a big thing here in San Diego, right? We've got nuclear ships sitting right out here in the bay today. So UNNPI data, all of that kind of data falls underneath the CUI specified, and it has to be handled very differently than just standard CUI. U.S. persons, U.S. citizens, where can that content be stored, et cetera. And so if you have both of these, that really drives down the types of systems that you can implement and the kinds of boundaries that you may need to look at implementing for that. When Daniel brought up the FARS CUI rule, that is a big one. That's one that, we've been tracking the FARS CUI rule now for, I've been tracking it for probably 4 years. The FARS CUI rule, when that drops, that is going to greatly expand the implementation of what today we have with DFARS 7012. We're expecting essentially a DFARS 7012 type clause for the entire federal government is essentially what it is the FARS CUI rule. When that comes out, that's going to take the requirements that we have, similar requirements to what we have with DFARS 7012, and say, okay, now this applies to all of the agencies in the government. So if you have NASA contracts, if you have Department of Homeland Security contracts, you have Department of Energy contracts, you have Department of the Interior contracts, wherever you have contracts, if you have controlled and classified information attached to those contracts, now that FARS CUI rule is going to say you have to protect them with NIST 800-171 as a minimum. So you can see we're moving not just from, the 50 to 60,000 contractors that DoD says have controlled and classified information. I believe that number is actually a lot higher than 50 to 60,000 contractors. But now you're talking about the 300,000 contractors that we had, that the DoD has identified. That number may exceed 1 million potentially, right? So you're greatly expanding the impact on industry when the FARS CUI rule actually gets released. Is Jacob here? Oh, there he is. Jacob, have you heard anything on the date? I mean, my expectation was going to be sometime in the next month or so, but.
So again, just to go back, here's a fun note. If you look at the footnote in 800-171 and 171A, it will say that the official guidance is coming out from NARA in a FAR rule that they're currently working on. Right now, the schedule that we've seen shows that coming out sometime in November. Likely the 60-day comment period would be over the holidays if the schedule holds up. The idea was that this FAR CUI rule was supposed to come out like 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And a lot of the confusion that we have is a result of we have the security requirements for non-federal companies. We have the overall CUI program. We don't have the FAR rule in the middle, right. And so we keep asking the government for clarification, and they have nothing to go off of. And we just keep going around and around and around. So that FAR clause, when it comes out, will probably help clarify quite a few things.
So, by show of hands, how many of you have contracts with federal agencies beyond Department of Defense if you are a contractor? A lot of you, right? And so, these same rules, if you've been building your infrastructure, and let's say, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but if you built an enclave environment to hold your DoD CUI, and now all of a sudden we've got this FARS CUI rule that has expanded the scope of CUI in your infrastructure, now that enclave may not be sufficient, and you may need to expand the size or the scope of that enclave. And so those are some of the things that we need to talk about as we get into scoping.
It can be a very slippery slope. NIST 800-171 is not going away. On the Discord channel, the CUI Discord, somebody mentioned CMMC is great. It just pointed people back to what they should have been doing the whole time, right? DFARS 7012. And so, but yeah, once that starts expanding, the cost and the impact of that and the boundary, I mean, that's going to significantly increase, right? So the next thing we're going to talk about is identifying CUI, right? And this is a process that is not an easy process, but comes across really 3 major pillars. The first one that we talk about is physical. So I talk to a lot of manufacturing companies, and manufacturing companies have manufacturing facilities. Go figure, right? So in those buildings, they do commercial work traditionally, as well as work that would be considered CUI on behalf of the DoD. And so when they're producing that, the question always gets asked, Daniel, do I have to protect the physical buildings because they're also processing CUI? Well, I think the answer would, of course, be yes, right? And so the cost impact of this, when you're looking to segment some of the work you're doing from a DoD perspective versus commercial, you have to assess the physical buildings and manufacturing equipment that you might be using as part of that. drawings, ITAR documents, things of that nature that might just be posted up in somebody's office. They don't think anything different of it. They're doing their job, right? They're making these parts.
To that point, I have somebody in this room, I'm not going to identify them unless they want to identify themselves, but they work with an organization that literally had printed out drawings and posted these drawings up in the cubicles across all of their offices, and come to find out that had ITAR data printed out on these cubicles across the entire office, and there were people potentially walking around that didn't have access or should not have had access to ITAR. So they had to pull all of that stuff down and completely remediate that whole situation. So, the physical aspect of this is real, and you have to really pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one up here, I think this thing has a little distance on it, is actual systems. So again, part of kind of the environment and the assessing, and the very first bullet I have on there is identities. Is the actual systems that are going to be in scope of that, of processing, transmitting, et cetera, CUI data. And a question I get asked all the time, and I'm going to kind of hit it back to you, Scott, is can I use a shared identity that's going to access commercial systems, and that same identity is going to access systems that have CUI on them?
Yeah, so you have to be really careful with that, because if you have, if that identity is not being protected to the same level, to the 801.71 level, then, no, you can't. Now, if you have an identity that's being protected to that level that is then being used to access, a commercial system or what have you, it is possible, depending on some of the controls you put in place. But in general, no, you don't want to use authentication information from a compliant system to access a non-compliant environment.
Yep.
It's typically the approach.
Makes sense, right? I mean, the concept of shared systems is very hard to execute in the sense of making sure that your compliance boundary is kept intact, right? Identities being the primary one. Servers, backups, databases on a business applications. When we're walking through this, physical is a little bit easier, right? You can usually lay eyes on something that could be considered CUI or produces CUI in that regard. Systems, a little bit harder to find, right? So from a technology approach, searching backup data, metadata, searching Office 365 using things like eDiscovery or advanced eDiscovery, going through and identifying and just doing some keyword searches. Some of the legacy CUI terms like FOUO, I think it's a very popular one, SBU, going through and seeing, hey, like I might not be aware of it as a technical, sys or cloud admin, but I'm going to run this query occasionally to see if there's anything inside of my system boundary, not necessarily my compliance boundary, that needs to be moved or sanitized in a way away from it.
Yeah, so one of the big challenges that I've been helping customers with recently that they don't really realize falls within the boundary for CUI are things like their ERP systems. Okay, ERP systems are a big challenge because ERP systems are where that's where you typically bill for things, right? And so you have invoices in there, and on invoices, many times those invoices are going to have, especially if you're a manufacturer, they may have a part number on the invoice for the government to pay you, or whoever, or your prime contractor to pay you. Well, that part number, if it's for a piece of equipment that was made specifically for the military or for a contract, not COTS, that part number in and of itself is controlled unclassified information. So now your entire ERP system, your invoicing system, all of that it has to be within this boundary for controlled unclassified information. It causes a real problem, especially for companies that have both commercial as well as government sides of their business, because they don't want to have to force their entire ERP system into a secured CUI boundary. Obviously, you've got cost impacts. It's really, really challenging. So those kinds of things, when you start talking about line of business systems, get really, really sticky. Yep,
very quickly. The next one that we're going to talk about, really that kind of last main pillar, if it will click up here, is cloud services. So I think Ryan might have mentioned on the previous talk about FedRAMP and the DFARS 7012 requirement around FedRAMP moderate or moderate equivalent, right? And understanding from an external cloud provider, what are those systems going to do for me, right? Are they going to meet FedRAMP? And I got some horror stories for you guys, but I talk to, again, technical people all the time, or even C-suite executives, and they're like, hey, I told my team, or hey, I implemented NIST 171 or CMMC level 3, been working on it for a year, been working on it for a year and a half, It's like, oh, that's great, Where have you been doing that work in? And they'll list data centers or environments that don't even probably can spell FedRAMP a lot of the times, right? So that obviously becomes an issue, right? Because we're trying to meet part of the requirement without the full understanding of the requirement, which, as the previous two talks indicate, those are very deep wells.
Yeah. The cloud services piece is something that does cause a lot of challenge In fact, I was having a conversation just before this talk, just a few minutes ago, about specifically the FedRAMP moderate requirement for cloud services, because the question was to me, well, the services that I want to use, they don't have FedRAMP compliance, right? So I don't want to go to an inferior product because they haven't done FedRAMP. I want to use the great, cool gee whiz, product, but they haven't been through the FedRAMP process, and so you can't. Now, there is the FedRAMP moderate equivalency designation out there, but the problem is the government has identified what that means. Right. What does FedRAMP moderate equivalent mean, and who is going to be the one that is going to check off the box and say, yeah, you're meeting FedRAMP moderate equivalency? Who's going to do that? Is your auditor going to come down, your assessor, when you go through your DIBCAC DCMA high assessment, and you're going to basically hand them the SSP of your cloud service provider that isn't FedRAMP? Are they going to go through everything in that document? I don't know. Maybe they will, but you're going to have to provide that documentation to that assessor because they haven't gone through FedRAMP. If they've gone through FedRAMP, you can basically just say, okay, this entire infrastructure has been through FedRAMP, and then this is what I did on top of that as part of my client responsibilities, to meet all of the 801.71 controls on top of the FedRAMP controls. So yeah, you do get pushed into some inferior products at some points in time. For example, with our managed services offering, it was a real challenge for us to build a managed services offering that provided all the capabilities that we wanted to provide. Because so many of the services out there, the cloud services that support the managed services provider community, are not in FedRAMP infrastructure. And many of them are not even in the United States, right? And so we had to build internal tools. For example, we use ConnectWise as our PSA solution internally, and we had to build that in Azure Government in like an on-prem style. We had to build and host our own ConnectWise environment rather than using the ConnectWise cloud environment. And you run across those kinds of issues over and over and over again. And then, yes, that hits us as a managed service provider. It's going to hit you guys as defense contractors, because you're going to have the same types of choices to make when you are implementing systems. So
one kind of additional tag on to that, and I'm going to kind of pose this back to you, going back to cyber incident reporting, right? One of the DFARS requirements. Cloud, does FedRAMP just cover it enough to also cover cyber incident, or is that also something you should be asking your partners for the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. You should be asking that. I mean, you mentioned cyber incident reporting, and we're going to hear, about DC3 and all of that and their perspectives on this. But there are 4 bills right now in Congress about cyber incident reporting. 4 different bills. I think one of them is House and 3 of them are Senate bills right now, and they have to go through reconciliation and do all the things. But essentially, under DFARS, we have a 72-hour requirement to report our cyber incidents. Well, in these new 4 requirements or 4 bills that are out there, depending on which bill you're looking at, there's anywhere from a 24 to a 72-hour requirement in those 4 bills, where you would have to report to the government any kind of breach that you may have. And in there, it calls out specifically managed service providers, cloud service providers, critical infrastructure providers. One of them calls out, it says designated organizations. It doesn't even say which specific type of provider it is. But in general, what I'm getting at is that these reporting requirements are only going to increase. Okay, federal contractors was another one that was specifically called out. So not only would you have the requirement under DFARS to report in 72 hours, but under one of these new bills, you may have a requirement to report under another scheme, potentially as early as 24 hours after a bill. And, for things like ransomware, that's another one. You have to report how much, within 24 hours of paying a ransom, you have to report that. There's all these kinds of reporting requirements that are coming into play, and you have to make sure that you have your service providers, your managed service providers, and your cloud service providers that you're working with are meeting these same exact requirements that you have to meet. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself in a situation. Now, one other point on that, because this isn't really the point of the talk, but I wanted to identify one more thing about those 4 bills that are in committee today. One of the bills specifically identifies fines, so specific fines that go above and beyond just the regulatory. You didn't do your requirement. But the fine that's called out in one of these bills is 0.5% of previous year revenue per incident that you do not report. So it's a significant fine. So those are the things that the government is looking at right now to ensure that as a community, we're reporting this information up so that we can identify these trends nationwide. because we do have nation state actors out there attacking us on a daily basis.
And I mean, if you look at obviously the DFARS 7012 requirement, I mean, it's going to expand more and more to end up impacting other federal organizations, right? So, and that's kind of the interesting piece is DoD is a little bit ahead of the curve, right? Especially with some of these pending, bills or laws that are going to be passed in relation to cyber incident reporting. But you guys are a little ahead of the curve on that, which is great, right? Now, again, making sure that you're vetting your systems appropriately, making sure you're searching your systems appropriately. Again, we talked about scanning backups and storage accounts and things of that nature to make sure that there isn't CUI in this boundary, so you can make sure to either get it out if there is, or redefine what that scope looks like. So the boundary strategy that we're going to talk about is really one of two options. So when we're talking about the CUI boundary, we're talking lift and shift, right? Let's forklift it all up somewhere, right? That's going to meet all of our requirements. Or let's go into talk about an enclave. Now we're going to talk about pros and cons of both of those. If you're primarily a DoD contractor and that's the main source of work that you do, it's probably going to be make a little bit more sense for your entire organization to go. When we're looking at an enclave approach, that is a little trickier, right? Because, well, where is my CUI, right? Where is that going to sit at? And that's what the next few slides here are going to talk about. So the first one we're going to talk about is lift and shift, or moving the entire organization, right? So a lot of what we do is in relation to the Microsoft cloud, specifically the government cloud. So we leverage tools like GCC High, right? We're going to move data that has basic CUI requirements as well as potentially specified CUI requirements to that Microsoft Gov platform. And we're going to leverage great tools like data loss prevention on the endpoint, which is now available in GCC High for those that are already there. DLP in the cloud, advanced threat protection, or what's called Defender series inside of Office 365, as well as leverage Azure services, right? There's a lot of great tools like Azure Sentinel, that's a SIM tool. They're building this whole ecosystem. Now, I want to make sure to say this. Microsoft is a great solution, and we fully endorse it, obviously. But there's so much more to do on top of this, right? This is a great piece because it can help baseline your environment to make sure you're meeting NIST Standard 171 from a security controls approach, right? As well as CMMC level 3. So they have things like placemats and blueprints inside of Azure that will help you actually execute and check those boxes. Especially for smaller or medium-sized organizations, it makes a lot of sense because of the technical staff, right? I mean, it just takes a lot of technical resources to do this on-prem. And we talk to companies all the time that have full, huge enterprises on-prem with multiple FTEs. And to bring those environments up to those compliance requirements is a struggle.
And, you see here pretty much everything being within the boundary. Obviously, after the two talks that we had this morning, I think everybody's well aware that this is not a technical problem, right? There's a lot more that goes on in building policies and procedures and all of that stuff, to help you meet these requirements. But from a technical standpoint, moving everything from a legacy environment, a non-compliant infrastructure, into a compliant infrastructure is a significant undertaking. It's very expensive. It can be very expensive. But then you also have to worry about the things that may be not necessarily in the cloud. You may be a manufacturer and you have things that are sitting in your manufacturing floor that you can't move to the cloud. It has to happen in the facility because you have to build things, right? And so bringing that up to standard is a challenge. You may be sitting with a Windows XP machine trying to run some kind of CNC system that the company that built the software went out of business in 2003, and if that thing shuts down, you're out of business kind of situation, right? Well, there's mitigations, there's ways you can handle that, air gapping it, and there's other kinds of things that you can do to address those situations and those problems. But you have to take a holistic approach to bringing an entire organization up to standard, and it can take. In many cases, it can take years depending on the complexity of the organization. So, it's not something that you want to wait, obviously, to the last minute to try and do. The great thing about the Microsoft Cloud Platform is that, at least with, the endpoints that you see here, the phones and the laptops, we can reach out and touch and control those laptops with this infrastructure. With things like Defender for Endpoint and Intune, we have the ability to really bring all of these devices into a compliant state using the Office 365 and the Azure platform. And if you're in a situation where you're small enough that you can move all of your server infrastructure and back office infrastructure into the cloud, it's very easy not very easy. That's a mistake. It is more simple to implement a full up cloud solution as a small business than as a mid-size or large business, because you don't have a lot of legacy solutions that you have to deal with that are typically on premises. So lift and shift, especially in the small medium business,
Yep.
this is really where you can really make a big change in your organization and get there much quicker than trying to do it as a medium to large business with lots of on-premises and historical and manufacturing and that kind of stuff.
We talk a lot about user impact as part of this, right? When we're going through consulting conversations or just general, what if kind of scenarios, user impact is huge, right? I mean, I've got 500 users or 200 or 5, right? It doesn't matter, thousands of users. What does this impact look like? And if you're already using the Microsoft platform, which I'm assuming a lot of you already are, then that's actually not that big of a change for them, right? It's still Office 365. It's just built in a compliant manner. Now, there are certain collaboration capabilities and things like that we can go into more details about that I'm sure some of you in the GovCloud are missing coming from the commercial environment. But from a user experience, it's significantly simpler. After you reset up your Outlook profile, for example, you're just sending emails, you're encrypting emails just like you might have always done. So, pros and cons. And so this is, again, kind of helping in that decision process, right? When you're talking to your executive team, right, about what do we do? Do we move everything or do we move just a little bit of stuff, right? Do we build an enclave? Some of the pros being around, you're going to assume compliance around all those systems, right? Just like we saw in the picture before, everything's going to be in that green box, right? Our CMMC or NIST 171 or DFARS 7012 kind of flow down box. Which is great, right? Corporate IP as well as government IP or DoD specific in relation to CUI is also going to be protected to the same level, which is, again, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want more cybersecurity to protect their intellectual property? Very few companies, right?
It's this is one of the challenges that we see, with the lift and shift, the all-in approach is, you do have to assume compliance around all the systems because you've got to build that compliant infrastructure for everything. And that can be a challenge, as I mentioned earlier. Almost all cases, you rarely find a company that is going to want to, that does not want to, as Daniel was saying, does not want to protect their corporate IP. What they don't want is they don't want to be hamstrung by the potential challenges, and they don't want the user impact.
Yep.
Because that user impact can be seen as significant. The way that Microsoft has continued to build out the infrastructures, that user impact is continuing to lessen with the new capabilities and features that Microsoft is rolling out. For example, coming out with things like B2B capabilities where we can do sharing between commercial infrastructure and gov infrastructure and between tenants within the gov infrastructure. Those capabilities are lessening the user impact and making it an easier place to collaborate. So overall, I think that that is over time is continuing to decrease. From a support cost standpoint, if you're going all in on a single infrastructure, your overall support costs are going to be lower because you're managing a single infrastructure rather than managing multiple infrastructures. If you went in with an enclave, and we'll talk about this when we get to the enclave, you're going to end up with, by definition, multiple infrastructures to manage. So now if you're in Office 365 Commercial and you're in Office 365 GCCI, you now have 2 infrastructures that you have to manage day to day. And trying to keep those potentially in sync from an operational standpoint, you've got to deal with that. You've also got to deal with potentially 2 sets of accounts for each user in your environment. And you've got additional costs depending on the situation. If you have a situation where your users have to operate in both the commercial infrastructure as well as the GCCI infrastructure, you're now double licensing your users. So that enclave, can have a higher support cost versus the bringing the entire organization into a single platform, and that could that would lower your support costs overall.
Consolidation of IT solutions, right? When we're talking to company, which is that next one there, we're talking to companies, a lot of them use a lot of third-party vendors. It's great, right? There's a lot of incredible capability out there and a lot of incredible tool sets. Not a lot that meet the requirements in full for DFARS 7012, which again becomes a little bit of an issue. And so when we're talking to organizations, and specifically around Microsoft, we're looking to consolidate as many tools into a single offering as we can, right? Whether that's with an E3 license or an E5 license or the equivalent of that being G3 and G5 in the GovCloud, we want to extend that and simplify your infrastructure for not only your technical staff that's going to be supporting it long term, but from a billing perspective, right? Renewals being kind of wrapped into a single item or license set. And then also some of the additional pros, right? Living in the Microsoft ecosystem Azure Sentinel, which is one of the SIM tools, doesn't charge for ingestion fees of Microsoft's hosted services, right? So even some cost savings long-term in relation to using, 10, 12, 15 different products to meet your compliance requirement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. We see a lot of cost savings from
Yep.
companies that decide to go all in on the specific platform, on the Microsoft platform, simply because they're able to get rid of a bunch of third-party products. Instead of dealing with, the licensing, the implementation, the integration, the management of all of those, dozen plus products, they can go to a single platform with a single license on top of it, and now you have an integrated solution to manage on a day-to-day basis. We have had customers that have literally gone from 12 to 15 vendors down to one, essentially,
Yep.
by moving into an all-in solution, and that provided significant cost savings to them that way outweighed the cost differential of Office 365 GCC High over and above what they were with Office 365 Commercial.
Yep.
So that's a definite pro.
Some of the cons, as you guys can see up here, some of them we've already talked about. Potential disruption of the commercial portion of business, right? So whenever you're lifting and shifting your whole organization to be in this compliant platform, there are certain systems you just might not be able to use anymore. We've kind of beaten that a little bit earlier in the talk, but just know that, you really need to understand the business in its entirety, right? What services are being consumed. Go through and do interview processes. We do user persona building is what we call it, but we'll talk about, what types of users do you have? What types of systems are they using on a daily basis, right? Are they just an email user that's sitting on a government contract, collecting a pay stub and a company newsletter? Great, that's one kind of small segment. Oh, do you have manufacturing users that use a shared kiosk system? That might be another one, right? Oh, do you have back office staff with accounting systems and things like that need to be brought into scope? Okay, let's talk about that, right? So whether that's a combination of, the contracts team, the technical team, executives kind of all getting buy-in together, but it's an important exercise to go through. There's a concept, as you guys are well aware of at this point, called CUI data flow, right? Where is this data coming in? What sources? Am I getting a USB drive? Is somebody FedExing me, a document that happens to have ITAR in it, which we don't want to happen, right? So what does that boundary kind of look like? And so just know that whenever you move to the GovCloud, there could be disruptions to just the commercial portion of that business.
Yeah, and so, this next con here, I'm not sure I necessarily see it as a con, but, if you're an organization that's using systems, it could be considered a con. You are going to potentially have to migrate off of non-compliant systems, right? If you're in Office 365 Commercial, if you're doing Linux email in a co-located data center that is not FedRAMP, you're going to have to move off of these platforms and move into a compliant environment. So that's going to impact that bottom con, which is cost, right? You're going to have a migration cost. There is going to be a cost to implementing the system to standard and a cost to migrate from whatever solution you're in today into this compliant environment. That is a real cost that is not really avoidable. Yeah. You have to do it if you're going to bring your entire infrastructure up to standard. And so you've got both licensing and migration costs in that. Either way, it doesn't matter if you do the Enclave or if you do the lift and shift, you still have to do the implementation, right? So that kind of cancels out. Licensing cancels out to a degree, but with a full up implementation, a lift and shift style implementation, you're going to have a higher licensing cost simply because you're doing all of your users rather than a subset of your users, right?
My favorite is talking to primarily DoD contractors that are leveraging Lotus Notes still, right? It's still out there. It's still awake. People are still using it. Hundreds of users out there are still consuming Lotus Notes, which if you're in the IT field, that's what makes you cry a little bit at night. But, it's still in production. There are systems out there that you thought would have been retired years ago. Windows 2000 server boxes that are hanging out, still assigning DHCP addresses, IP addresses out there, and line of business systems.
SharePoint 2003.
SharePoint 2003 still out there. Functional domain levels still at Windows Server 2003. I mean, it is the amount of technical debt, and this is a little bit of a justification here, but the amount of technical debt that organizations have, even if you were to subtract the DFARS requirement, just in general production, it is huge for some of these organizations. This is a great way to kind of push forward and get past that and start upgrading those systems, not only for compliance, but just general good functionality, right? So, right, next up here, we have the Enclave Approach. So again, lift and shift, we're going to assume everything is going to be under that compliance boundary in relation to NIST and CMMC, et cetera. The next kind of option that we have here, as you can see through these beautiful pictures, is your corporate IT infrastructure, and then as well as a separate CUI enclave type environment. So like the gentleman back here mentioned, they have a specified CUI enclave where they're going to process things like ITAR data potentially. And so this is a great solution, comes with some pros and cons that we'll talk about here in a minute, but this is a very common solution for universities. It's very popular, right? So they have DoD grants or they have DoD funding that has flow down requirements that they don't want to bring their whole commercial network up to meet CMMC level 3 or NIST 800-171. And so this is a very popular solution, especially when you can do what's referred to as a bridged enclave, right? So we're going to bring in maybe some manufacturing facilities or research labs into the scope of that boundary. And again, making sure everything's brought up to both the CMMC and NIST 800-171 requirements there.
I'd like to just address the GCC-GCCI thing one more time, because in your situation, both of these would be green, okay? So you would be green for CUI in the corporate IT boundary, right? And then the cloud enclave that you have here would be really for ITAR or CUI specified content. So, you've got a different version of this enclave that you would be dealing with,
So talking about the pros and cons, when you're trying to make the decision, do I move everybody? Do I move just a little piece of just the DoD work? Pros, smaller environment to manage, right? Typically, that's going to be a smaller subset of users, as well as applications that might need to be consumed for that. No impact to the commercial portion of business. Again, we work with very large enterprises sometimes that have tens of thousands of users, and their DoD revenue or revenue generated by the flow down here for DFARS 7012 requirement is 7% of their revenue, right? So they're like, hey, what can we do to not disrupt commercial? That's the bulk of our revenue. And we end up starting to talk about the enclave approach. And then the cost savings, right? Smaller environment, smaller users, usually cheaper licensing cost, so forth and so on.
Yeah, I mean, from a pro standpoint, it says smaller environment to manage, but that one really is kind of tied to the second con that we have over here, the additional support costs to manage multiple environments.
Yep.
So yeah, managing your enclave environment is going to be smaller and more contained. It's not going to be as wide ranging, but now you have two environments that you're having to manage and potentially more depending on if you have multiple enclaves, because that does happen sometimes as well. So, something to think about there. And, from a con standpoint, I'll let you go ahead and jump in on the con.
Yeah, I mean, CUI must be identified. Obviously, if an enclave is going to work, you've got to figure out if the CUI can fit in the box, right? For the simplistic version of that. And again, a lot of organizations don't have enough due diligence or even staff to do due diligence to make sure that they've identified the CUI, right? The data flow map, the ingestion points, et cetera.
That's the biggest one for me, is the ingestion points for CUI, because all the CUI comes from somewhere. Either you're creating it or you're being sent it, right? And so if you have an enclave environment, and your primary corporate email is not in that enclave, and you're getting sent controlled and classified information in email, which is very common. Now you've got CUI content not in your enclave. You're having to take that CUI content and move it over to your enclave. Well, you still have that content sitting in your non-compliant infrastructure. So now you essentially have a spillage, and now you have to clean that up. And how do you control what people are sending to you? This is one of the biggest challenges I see with an enclave approach, especially with an organization that may get a fair amount of CUI, is you don't control how and when you receive controlled and classified information from partners, from government, from whoever. You don't control that, and that information is going to enter your non-compliant infrastructure, your non-compliant boundary, and you're now going to have to not only move that content into your enclave, but you're also going to have to clean up the content that is in your non-compliant infrastructure. And that adds a significant support cost to your environment. So that's a big challenge. Identifying that CUI and both how you get it, how you create it, and how you manage it is really, really important.
Now, there are kind of approaches when leveraging a technology like, I'm going to scoot back one slide, leveraging a technology like Azure Virtual Desktop, right? That's our typical deployment where we're talking about securing an endpoint, if you will, inside of the Microsoft GovCloud. We see a lot of organizations starting to roll this out, not necessarily for their internal consumption, but to share CUI with subcontractors, right? So there is a large kind of push towards, hey, I can't send this to you because you don't even know how to spell DFARS, right? Like that's a little bit of an issue, right? So, and so using environments like this where you're disabling things like copy and paste, right? Printing, folder redirection, items like that to help secure and make that boundary really slick.
One of the interesting enclave approaches that we started to see, especially among some of our larger customers, is really creating an enclave for their subcontractors specifically. So they've built their entire infrastructure to standard. Okay, so they're ready to go, but they don't want to necessarily give their subcontractors access to their internal infrastructure. So then they build another enclave infrastructure that is basically dedicated to their subcontractors, so that those subcontractors have an Azure Virtual Desktop environment that they can log into, that's where they can interact with the company from a CUI export control standpoint, so they don't have to rely on ensuring that their subcontractors have all the systems in place to be able to manage controlled and classified information appropriately. And so I think that's an approach that we're going to see a lot more of, especially when you start talking about the super smalls, the micro businesses, the 2 to 5 employee type companies that literally just don't have the means to build out these infrastructures. Having them basically work inside their prime contractors' environments. That's going to be an approach that I think we're going to see a lot more.
Yep, I agree. And we're starting to see it a lot right now, even because there's a lot of distrust, right? People have been asking for, hey, we want to make sure you're submitted to SPRS, even prior to having a DFARS 7019 requirement, right? Primes are getting really nervous about their contracting base to be able to help them. And so rightfully so. I mean, NIST 80171 and the DFARS requirement has been signed away many times without any action on it.
Right.
So
a couple other ones that we have here, we talked about in the all-in approach, your commercial environment, your commercial information is being protected at the same level as the government CUI. In this environment, in an enclave approach, it may not be. That depends on the configuration of your commercial environment, but it's not going to be protected at the same level, and that's not necessarily a great thing. So that would be a con. And then, what I mentioned earlier about the CUI spillage, the CUI spillage piece, you're going to get that CUI coming into your commercial email. Now you've got to identify it, you've got to clean it up, you got to get it over to the enclave. That's a big challenge. And then the last one would be the dual licensing piece, because if you're doing swivel seat, so that you've got somebody logging it over here on commercial, doing their day-to-day business, and then they have to log in over here through Azure Virtual Desktop to a completely different environment. That user is going to be licensed multiple times, and so that's going to be a significant cost to you as an infrastructure, depending on how many users you might have in that environment.
So the last kind of slide that we wanted to present here is just general strategy discussions, right? When you're in meetings, right, there are really 4 main ones that we've helped isolate what the best solution for an organization is. Do you know where your CUI data is? Again, we're going back to identification of CUI. What systems are going to store, transmit, process, et cetera, CUI data? The next one being, is your organization structured in a sense to separate the commercial work away from the DoD work? Most organizations share systems between the DoD work they're doing and the commercial work. Some don't, very rarely though. How many users have the potential need to access CUI, right? What's that number? If I were to build an enclave and 30% of my staff need to access that data, cost effectiveness might start going to the side, right? And then the last one is the revenue piece, right? Is the DoD work you're doing surpassing 15 to 20% of the revenue that you're capturing? And so again, going through these questions will help float to the top things like, do I go enclave? Can I go enclave? Or should I just go ahead and go lift and shift, especially with like the impending FARS CUI ruling?
Yeah, I was about to say, we said DoD contracts there, but really, that's federal government contracts. Because, with that FARS CUI rule, they're going to have the same requirements. So it's not just DoD that we're looking at 15, 20%. And that number is,
loose. That's
loose, right? What percentage of your business is going to be in the federal government space? If you get up, approaching 50% of your business is going to be in the federal government space, then it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for you to have a split environment. You probably need to just go all in and make sure that you protect your entire infrastructure. You're going to overall lower your support costs and or not increase your support costs as much, and you're going to have a more secure, more easy to use environment overall.